gender nonconformity is very high in, like bisexual, homosexual adults. So they experienced a lot of gender nonconformity when they were younger, but the same is also true for autistic people.
I don't know that I've thought about the connection between those two things, or about how people with autism might be more likely to be misdiagnosed with gender dysphoria. Hey everybody, I'm Brad Polumbo, and welcome back to the Damage Control Podcast, where we are reclaiming the LGBT community from the insane people who've taken it over. My guest today is the independent journalist Christina Buttons, who used to work at the Daily Wire, but now does independent coverage of the debate over youth gender medicine. We'll talk about the bombshell report that was just dropped in the UK on this issue, and she'll explain what she considers the gender medicine citation cartel. Plus, as always, we'll round out the show by reacting to some insane TikToks from the LGBT community. Don't forget to stick around and subscribe if you're new, hit that like button, and comment with your thoughts as we go along. Without further ado, let's get into it. Christina, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
At one point, you joined the Daily Wire. Folks will know the Daily Wire, the news outlet with Ben Shapiro, with Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, those people. And you joined them to report on gender medicine, but then you ended up quitting Daily Wire. Why did you decide to quit?
Well, the reason I joined a conservative outlet to begin with is because at the time we had no left-leaning coverage or center coverage of trans issues. It was the only place that you could publish something critical of the gender-affirming model of care is through a conservative outlet. So that was, and I was open-minded to working with them. Again, I had a good experience working in the newsroom, but I took issue with some of the things that some of the commentators said publicly. And so I quit, and I, publicly distanced myself from some of the things that were said by the commentators because I didn't feel like it was helping the situation at all. And it's good that, more awareness is brought to this issue to Republicans, but who really needs to hear this message is people on the left. And I think it was just sort of some of these comments were just contributing to further divide. And so I just felt like there's a better way to do this. And so I went.
What specifically was it that bothered you?
I quit the weekend that Michael Knowles at CPAC said that we need to eradicate transgenderism from public life entirely. I was pretty upset by that. But there was also some comments made just a few weeks earlier by Matt Walsh about Dylan Mulvaney, and I thought it was uncalled for. And
that long tirade of just demeaning Dylan's appearance and looks and very cruel personal stuff.
Counterproductive, but also just, I don't think you need to, go after people individually. People get really worked up about Dylan Mulvaney, but I just view them as like, this is just some TikTok influencer who you guys made famous.
Yeah, it's speaking of circular loops of citation cartels, right? Like Dylan Mulvaney says something, right wing gets really mad about it, then liberal media covers it sympathetically because the right wing is really mad about it. It's a feedback loop in its own right.
It is. Just doesn't really help the situation. I've always maintained, like, we have the evidence on our side, we have the moral argument, we have the moral high ground, we have the arguments. Like, we don't need to resort to attacks on people and even the comments about eradicating transgenderism from public life. Like, I don't want that. Like, I have friends who are trans and they're happy with their transition, and I'm happy for them. I'm just concerned about vulnerable adults who are dealing with a lot of other stuff and maybe attributing their distress to a trans identity being quickly affirmed with medical interventions. They come to regret it. So I feel like we need more safeguards for those people.
So you have covered the debate over youth gender medicine very closely for some time now, and we talked about it a little bit last week on the show. We cited some reporting from Benjamin Ryan, but just the Cass report, this huge report on gender medicine that just dropped in England. What were your main takeaways from it?
Well, it's we had an interim report come out about 2 years ago, so we had a good idea of what would be in it. But I, I mean, it's a very long report. A lot of us are still sort of going through it and digesting it all. But it's been, it's major already. There's talk in other countries of, rolling back gender affirming care and going with a much more cautious approach and halting the use of puberty blockers. I think it was, I think just today, Scotland announced that they're putting puberty blockers on pause. Even like Belgium recently had an article about them as well. And so it's going to hopefully have a huge impact.
How is it being received? Because I'm wondering, I've seen a lot of the extremely ideological kind of left-wing LGBT activist types spreading a lot of like false claims about the Cass report and also just kind of denying it and downplaying it. But outside of those circles, do you think it's really making an impact in the real world?
It's a little soon to tell. A lot of left-wing outlets have not covered it at all. But we've had a lot of good coverage from center-left and center-based outlets, of course, right-leaning outlets too. But so far, a lot of these medical organizations like the AAP and Endocrine Society have not issued a response. I believe WPATH has, but they're not even a real medical organization. A lot of people believe that they are, but they're an advocacy group posing as a medical organization. WPATH basically, denied the findings of the Cass report. And the other medical organizations so far have not issued any kind of statement. But the good news is that medical organizations around the world outside of the United States are responding to the Cass report and beginning to roll back their treatments and pause puberty blockers.
It's interesting watching this dichotomy because typically when you look at the progressive left in America, they love to look to Europe, right? For their policies, for their taxes and welfare, for their different all sorts of things. They're like, look at Europe, look at Europe, look at Europe. But in this one specific area where Europe, which started doing medical transitioning of minors before the US, many European countries started doing it before us, they're now moving back and saying like, whoa, we should slow down here. After looking at the data and the studies and finding it inconclusive or insignificant or not strong enough to justify these treatments. And all of a sudden, it's like American progressives don't want to look to Europe anymore.
And, the media outlets that they read also aren't covering it. And so a lot of people still don't even know about this huge development. But then there have activists who are just, trying everything to discredit it and say that, it isn't evidence-based. But when really it's them who don't understand the principles of evidence-based medicine, and they don't understand that a systematic evidence review is, the top of in the pyramid of evidence-based medicine. You can't go any higher.
Yeah, what are they saying about it? The activists trying to discredit it.
They're saying that it excluded too many studies, but the whole point of these kinds of reviews is that it excludes studies that don't meet the rigor set in evidence-based medicine. So they were very poor quality studies, and those studies were being used to promote youth transition treatments, and they really shouldn't have been in the first place. And the other part was the circular referencing. So it was those two things, the low quality studies and the circular referencing which is what created this sort of artificial consensus among medical organizations that people point to and say, look, all of the medical organizations endorse this treatment. That means it's safe and evidence-based. And, if you don't agree with them, then you're just a bigot.
Yeah, so let's get into that now then. Before we get into it specifically in the gender medicine context, what is a citation cartel, just generally speaking?
A citation cartel is a new term to describe kind of circular referencing among academics and universities to try to inflate the number of citations that a paper will receive. And doing this, it gives more like credibility and prestige to their work. So they go,
Because the number of citations is viewed as like a credible point in their favor, right?
it can actually depending on the number of citations that research groups receive, it can, significantly affect, their university's ranking and help them get millions in funding. So there's a lot of these incentives to participate in these citation cartels.
And when you talk about a citation cartel in the context of gender medicine, what do you mean? You're talking specifically about groups like WPATH and like the Endocrine Society, right? How are they engaged in a citation cartel? Because that's what you just reported on and discussed in an article for Reality's Last Stand, the Substack publication by Colin Wright that we refer to on the show from time to time. So we'll link to that. But just to give people a brief overview, what is the citation cartel in gender medicine that you've identified in this piece and in your reporting?
Yeah, well, rather than grant these organizations sort of like prestige and funding, they lend each other credibility by all circular referencing each other. And there's a systematic review done. One of the systematic reviews that came out sort of at the same time as the CAS review that was commissioned by the NHS. It looked specifically at the 23 international guidelines on transition and youth transition, and it found some pretty interesting things. It found that, WPATH and Endocrine Society, who released these sort of initial guidelines endorsing youth transition on very little evidence, they were extremely influential to other organizations. And there was some of the same authors on each of them. So together, these two sets of guidelines from 2009 and 2012, those heavily influenced other organizations. So the other organizations like national and regional ones like the AAP and so many others across the world, they would cite, WPATH and Endocrine Society's endorsement saying, this is safe to do.
Can you remind people what WPATH is?
Oh, yeah. WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. It was formerly the Harry Benjamin Society. And it's a collection of, like researchers, clinicians, mental health professionals who are in this group that it's not a real medical group. It's an advocacy org that promotes transgender health. Like even their guidelines aren't really technically guidelines. They're called the standard of care, and that's like a legal term, so they don't get any trouble for having that. And they're just basically, ideologues. They claim to be evidence-based, but they're actually not. They should not be using that term at all. Evidence-based refers to something very specific, and their guidelines do not meet those standards set by evidence-based medicine. So they're misleading people by calling their guidelines evidence-based.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that WPATH, when you kind of go through this game of telephone, right? That's what, when I was reading your article and I was trying to figure out what this citation cartel thing means, I was like, this is like a game of telephone, right? Like WPATH says this is the standard, then the Endocrine Society cites cites WPATH and says this should be the standard, then WPATH uses the fact that the Endocrine Society said this should be the standard as further proof that this should be the standard. And then you start to go to the AMA, the American Medical Association, the APA, the American Psychological Association, these other medical groups that will then say, well, the Endocrine Society says that this is the right thing to do, right? So it becomes this big game of telephone. And at the end, you get so many Americans and so many people in the LGBT community who aren't familiar with data and research. Like they don't do what you or I do. Have just heard and taken it as true because they've heard it from the quote unquote experts that all of this medical transitioning for minors is safe and effective, and all the studies show it helps and is safe. They genuinely believe that. When I encounter good-hearted people who support this stuff happening for kids and being available for kids, they genuinely believe that. They just cite the AMA, they just cite the APA, they say, the experts say it's all safe and effective, all the studies show this, and it's not actually a true statement. It's not a remotely true statement, but it's one that's been parroted so many times by people with expert affiliations that I can understand why everyday people fall for it and believe it.
That is the biggest hurdle that I've come across in the 2 years that I've been reporting on this issue. It's trying to convince people like the medical organizations have this wrong. And that's it's been difficult because, the other mainstream media outlets, they just frame the issue as totally partisan. They say, all medical organizations endorse this, but, you have these like right-wing bigots who are trying to prevent trans kids from being who they really are. It's been the hardest hurdle to cross, but hopefully with the CAS review, we're going to be seeing some progress soon, I hope. But it's just difficult because these organizations that have endorsed this treatment on bad evidence, like how are they going to be able to walk it back? I don't see them saying like, oh, we made a mistake.
Right, because they would be admitting that they allowed kids to go through treatments that in many cases permanently altered their bodies or led to infertility or led to all these things. And it's this sunk cost fallacy, right? It's like they have staked their professional reputations on this. I worry that, in the true spirit of science, changing information or even just a better understanding of the information, you would change your opinion, right? If you're one of these scientific bodies, but they're going to have a strong incentive to try to squint at the data to continue their defense of this, because to admit they were wrong would be a huge admission of error. It would be a huge embarrassment. And obviously it's the right thing to do. It's better than doubling down on a bad approach that's not supported by the evidence. But I'm not super optimistic that they'll come around, because that's a very real human thing that people do. They have a big resistance to admitting they're wrong or changing their mind when they've invested or staked a lot on a position.
Yeah, and people have this wrong impression too. If like the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, has like 70,000 members or so, they think like, oh, well, it's 70,000 pediatricians say this is okay, but that's not the case at all. It's a few people at the top who invest heavily in lobbying. And there have even been a number of AAP pediatricians who have, for 4 years, this may be the 5th year, they've been petitioning the AAP leadership to align the guidelines with systematic evidence review results. And so far, they've refused to do so until last year. They finally said, okay, we'll conduct our own systematic evidence review. We're waiting for the results of that, but a lot of people have been misled, to say the least.
Yeah, I spoke with one guest, and I actually can't even remember who it was, to be honest, but they made the point to me that the partisan politics, actually, you know who it was? It was Katie Herzog, who I really like. She's a friend. She hosts the Black and Reported podcast. and she does not support these laws preventing kids from medically transitioning, where I support at least the idea of laws preventing medical transitioning for minors. Some of the specific laws I think are very poorly written, but I support legal action in principle to do that. And so we had an interesting back and forth about this. And one of the things that she said was that she believes part of the reason that the scientific community is so reticent to admit that it was wrong is because this has become a political and partisan issue, right? Like when there's changing tides in, for example, there was that big, and I'm going to sound dumb because I'm obviously talking about things I'm not an expert in now, but there was that like decongestant or medication that everyone has been using for years that they recently found out does nothing, right? And people are now in the medical community adapting to that, right? And they're going to come up with new medicines and other things because it's not politicized, like it's not ideological. But this debate, and it's hard to say who like started it or who made it this way. But when you have Republicans passing laws along party lines banning this, and then you have Democrats on party lines defending this, it then becomes like a partisan issue that makes it like very difficult for these industry associations or these area of scientific expertise associations like the AAP or like the AMA to admit they were wrong or to take a position that's the Republican position. Whereas if this had never become a political issue and had just stayed in the realm of scientific and medical ethics, maybe it would be easier for them to evolve. I thought it was an interesting point. To me, the ship has kind of sailed on that one. So you can't really put that genie back in the bottle, but I did think it was an interesting perspective.
Yeah, definitely. But activism and activist orgs have really pushed this treatment on kids and this narrative that you can be born with a fixed brain-based gender identity that doesn't change throughout your life. That's the main justification used to transition minors. But the truth is, it's a psychiatric condition with a very high rate of persistence. And most parents and anybody transitioning today is usually not getting the correct information from their doctors. So we should expect to see a lot more lawsuits. There are already a number in the works right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. That could be another path through which this changes, the legal path. I think if you see some big lawsuits come down that find that this treatment wasn't appropriate or wasn't justified or that doctors administered it recklessly, money talks. And I think that you will start to see some changes if big verdicts come down.
Yeah, the whole affirmative model is reckless. It's, immediate affirmation of trans identity, self-diagnosed, and just immediate referrals for medical interventions. And just the model itself, like it's just not sustainable. It should be a cautious and individualized approach.
It's interesting too because you contrast the affirmative model of like doctors immediately accepting whatever a child tells them about their gender, moving very quickly to prescribing them blockers or hormones. You contrast that with something like ADHD, right? Where, for a while they were giving out a serious ADHD medication too easily, but now they've really started to crack down on this, and you have to go through a rigorous screening process, and they don't just accept your word for it. Doctor, I have ADHD. Give me some Ritalin, right? They don't do that. They don't have an affirmative model, right? You have to be screened for it. You have to be tested. They have to make sure that it meets certain criteria, that it's disruptive to your academic or your work life or other things. And I obviously don't know all about that, but I'm saying they don't have an affirmative model for it, right? Which shows you, when you think about it in another context, it becomes obvious how bizarre that is as a model.
That's the trouble we have with a lot of psychiatric conditions is they're sort of diagnosed behaviorally, like there's no objective physical test. So that's why it's a mistake to frame trans identity as a medical condition that requires medical treatment, because it's not. And if there was an objective test like a brain or blood or something like that, it would make it a lot easier. But the truth is, like, there really is no medical or underlying condition. What we have is like a lot of people who are gender nonconforming and a lot of people who feel distressed about their gender, and that's being medicalized a lot of times when it shouldn't be.
But I think gender dysphoria is a legitimate psychiatric condition that some people experience.
Yeah, no, I do too. I'm just,
But
but
it's
I
not a
also,
there's no test for it, is what you're saying.
yeah, but I also believe that there's a big proportion of the current sort of population of trans people who, because we know a lot of teenagers, a lot of young girls are adopting trans identities. For a subset, it's people who are attributing their distress to gender dysphoria. They may not actually have it. That's what I've learned from interviewing so many detransitioners is a lot of them will say, like, I was misdiagnosed because they affirmed me so quickly and they didn't look at all of the other things going on, trauma and whatnot. I've also interviewed a number of detransitioners who, upon receiving an autism diagnosis in adulthood, realized that was what was going on with them. But they attributed their symptoms they were experiencing to gender dysphoria because it's sort of, it's talked about a lot in the media, and um, there's a lot of overlapping symptoms between autism and gender dysphoria.
That's a really interesting one. I don't know that I've thought about the connection between those two things, or about how people with autism might be more likely to be misdiagnosed with gender dysphoria when they're actually experiencing symptoms of autism.
Yeah, so we already know, and it's already been talked about a lot, that gender nonconformity is very high in, like bisexual, homosexual adults. So they experienced a lot of gender nonconformity when they were younger, but the same is also true for autistic people, is they also experience high rates of gender nonconformity. Um, and so there may be a subset maybe interpreting their gender nonconformity and their other symptoms going on as a trans identity, when the reality is that, they're not going to be happy living that way forever. I mean, I'm totally fine. I just want people to make informed decisions that they're going to be happy with in the long term, and that's clearly not happening right now. Like, if someone is going to be happy with their transition for the rest of their life, like, more power to you. But I just, in my experience, have interviewed like over 100 detransitioners, and there's something very wrong with the affirmative model of care, and it needs to be replaced.
All right. Well, Christina, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate your insight. And folks, I will link to her full reporting about the gender medicine citation cartel in the description. And we'll leave it there for now. Thanks again, Christina.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was great to talk to you.
All right, everybody. It's time for all of your favorite part of the podcast, where I subject myself to torture by reacting to insane TikToks from the alphabet people on the Clock app. Buckle up and get ready to lose some brain cells with me. But first, if you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts. Let me know which one of these is your favorite. Up first, new gender just dropped.
Did you know, however, there is a gender identity that is linked to the seasons? This is called gender season. And this is a gender identity I've only just learnt about. It's a micro identity. It's not an identity that I have ever heard discussed before. It's a new one for me. Gender season is an individual who explores their gender identity in relation to a season or all the seasons. So this might be somebody whose gender expression and identity is linked to one season. So for example, winter. Or this might be somebody whose gender identity and expression changes depending on the season.
No, ma'am. We're not doing this. Your Delulu is showing. This isn't a real thing, and I don't know how anybody can see stuff like this and not see that to some extent this is like becoming a internet fad or a clout chasing exercise in creating new identities to kind of stand in for a personality or to climb up the ranks of the oppression Olympics ladder, because being a boring old straight white woman is now verboten in these hyper online progressive spaces. So they have to come up with something. And also, you know that these new gender identities and all this like silly stuff they're coming up with, you know it's fake and not real when they're saying it's not even something they use, it's something that they heard about on Tumblr or Reddit or something. It's like, this isn't real. This isn't legitimate. And you're only doing a disservice to the LGBT community by trying to tie this kind of make-believe, nonsense, incoherent stuff to actual gay identity and lesbian identity and acceptance and normalization. Like, no, thank you. No, thank you. Because I mean, if you go up to the average American and tell them, oh, you need to accept seasonal gender identities that tie to the season, they're going to look at you like you're like you're insane, because you are. So please stop. Please put down the camera. Please stop posting, because babe, you're not helping. Up next, we've got a woke LGBT medical practice and business to hear from.
I'm a folks therapist. Of course I want to hear about all the members of your polycule.
I'm a folks therapist. Of course your emotional support dog, cat, bird, or reptile can come to session. And of course I'm going to want to know their names and pronouns. I'm a folks therapist. Of course I know you probably did that thing that you said that you weren't going to do. And of course I support you anyway.
I'm a folks therapist. Of course I'm going to understand your meme references.
I'm a folks therapist. Of course I use they them pronouns. I'm a folks therapist. Of course I'm neurodivergent affirming.
I'm a folks therapist. Of course you don't have to teach me about your specific identities. And of course I want to know how those identities have impacted your unique experience.
I'm a folks therapist. Of course I want to hear about your moon water and crystals. I'm a folks therapist. Of course you don't have to educate me on trans care.
I'm a folks therapist. Of course I'm going to tell you how incredibly proud I am of you.
I know what y'all are thinking. This is fake. This is satire. This is a parody video. It isn't. It's real. This is a real business called Folks Health. So, according to the website, this is Folks Health, the largest health and wellness platform for the LGBTQIA+ community. They take insurance, and they're now available in all 50 states. So it is funny to me how capitalist this left-wing, social justice organization is. They've got their prices plastered all over their website, but it's also interesting they seem to do a lot of remote services. So you can get hormone prescriptions or other things after meeting with their doctors over Zoom. And I have just a couple thoughts on the kind of video materials they're using from their official accounts to promote their business, like the one I played for you. First is that I just got to be honest, that video and the many others like it on their page would not fill me with confidence in their medical expertise and seriousness. In fact, it'd kind of be an enormous red flag that this place is run by ideological activists rather than actual doctors who follow the science. The other thing, too, is like, this person sounds like a terrible therapist. She's like, you're going to do that thing I told you shouldn't do, and I'll support you anyway. It's like, so you're just saying you'll enable your patient, you'll tell them they're perfect, you'll let them play the victim and not actually hold them accountable or force them to grow or push them in any way. I don't know. Would you trust a folks therapist? Let me know in the comments, because it's a no from me, dog. It's a no.
It's definitely a no from me, dog.
Up next, we've got a TikTok update from the world of trans lesbians, or transbian?
I wanted to speak a little bit about trans lesbians. As you see, I have the lesbian flag in back of me. I am a trans woman, although I do get misgendered a lot. It sucks, but that's okay. But I am also a trans woman who loves women. So I am a trans lesbian or a transbian. I have been with my wife for how long, Egg?
It'll be 22 years.
22 years. We've been together for 22 years, so this coming anniversary is going to be our 20th anniversary. But yeah, so I love women. I do like looking at some men, but having a relationship with a man is not something that I would normally think about. Non-binary people, I love them. I love you folks, so I could have a relationship with non-binary people, both A, M, A, B, and a GAB. Anyway, this started out about trans lesbians and will end as trans lesbians. Trans lesbians are valid in the lesbian community. We are strong.
Okay, so I have some thoughts. I hadn't heard anybody refer to themselves as a transbian before, but hey, we can unpack that. But first, I'm happy for this person that they've got a long-term partner or marriage that is working out, and good for you. I will say I find it incredibly strange to be going on multi-minute TikTok diatribes about who you are not sexually attracted to just in front of your wife, and when you are married. Like, I'm not really sure how that's appropriate. It seems very odd. There's also a weird degree of narcissism embedded into a lot of these TikToks, because I don't know about you, but I wasn't scrolling through the clock app wondering, I wonder what this individual's sexual orientation is in great detail. And I'm not sure there's anyone out there that was wondering that, but this individual decided that that was important to share. And you see this a lot with these like long TikTok diatribes about their unique special identities and everything. And it's like, babe, nobody really asked. Nobody really asked. And I'm not sure anybody really needs to know. And the other thing is, this person isn't a this person is bisexual. They said they would be interested in sexually or romantically or whatever. Again, you have a wife. Why are you talking about this? But whatever. Both non-binary people of either gender, basically. And since non-binary is fake and made up and not real, and they're just males and females, what they're saying is they're bisexual, and that's okay. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you're not a lesbian. You're not some new thing, new word you made up. And just stop. Stop inventing new things, new labels, tacking on new letters to the alphabet. You're just weighing us down. And on the trans lesbian or transbian thing specifically, I don't know exactly what they should call it, because I agree it's not the exact same thing as a typical heterosexual relationship. If you have a trans woman and a woman in a relationship, that's not the same thing as just a typical straight relationship. But it's not, definitionally, it is not a lesbian relationship in the same way that a trans man dating a man is not a gay relationship. And this is actually important. This is an important distinction, because our sexual orientations are rooted in biological sex, not gender identity. If we start to accept the premise that our orientations, what it means to be gay or what it means to be lesbian, is about gender or feelings of self-perception rather than about biology, then we are undercutting and erasing the whole born this way, biological attraction, can't choose it, not a choice, that whole narrative that earned us acceptance and normalization in the first place. We've now just undercut it in the name of wokeness or whatever the heck this all is. It's a hard no from me. A hard no.
It's definitely a no for me, dog.
But what do you guys think? Did you lose brain cells from these videos? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the like button if you're watching us on YouTube. And with that, that's it for this episode of the Damage Control Podcast, and I'll see you all next time.